Hello and welcome to the Pilgrim Way. My name is Norman Graham and I'm a minister in the Baptist Union of Churches in Scotland. The aim of these signposts is to try and help to connect the text of the Bible with our everyday lives. We've been working our way through the Sermon on the Mount, and today I want to read a few verses from the Gospel of Matthew chapter 7 beginning at verse 24. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority, and not as their teachers of the law. Well, the great Baptist preacher, farmer, social activist Clarence Jordan wrote that the meaning of these words of Jesus is so clear that comment is hardly necessary. And I do tend to agree with him. I think that generally our problem is not so much that we don't understand the meaning of Jesus' words, but rather that we find them difficult and uncomfortable. However, I also think that our over-familiarity with this final section of the sermon, with its famous parable, kind of blunts the profound power and meaning of these words, and so it might be helpful to reflect a little bit deeper on it. The first thing to note is that the word therefore, because it points us back to the terrible warning against the self-delusion of thinking that a verbal confession of Jesus' Lordship is all that's required in order to enter the kingdom of God. As we noted in a previous signpost, a confession that Jesus is Lord has to be matched by a way of living that is consistent with the claim. Any confession of his lordship, even if it's accompanied by powerful spiritual works like prophecy and casting out of demons or any number of miracles that you can think of, that claim would be a false claim if it's not expressed in embodied allegiance and obedience in our everyday lives. A point often missed due to a repeated use of the word Lord is that it also refers to a king. And to claim Jesus as your king requires you to give him your allegiance, and allegiance is expressed in embodied obedience to the king's commands. Jesus is not a great teacher whose words give advice for a happy and fulfilled life. He is the king. And so, as Matthew Bates puts it, we must stop asking others to invite Jesus into their hearts and start asking them to swear allegiance to Jesus the King. It's actually a very kind of topical point at the moment, for even as I was writing this signpost, preparations are being made for the coronation of King Charles III. It's become quite a divisive issue, and in Scotland there's a particular disquiet about swearing allegiance to him as king in light of the desire of many Scots for independence. The point is simply that to swear allegiance is to place yourself under the authority of another, something many people today are not willing to do. For if you're under the authority of the king, then you must obey what the king commands. That's kind of the point that Jesus is making here. In verse 21, Jesus says that it's only the one who does the will of the Father in heaven that will enter the kingdom. It's a thought expressed well in Dietrich Bonhoeffer's famous saying that only the believers obey and only the obedient believe. The parable of the wise and foolish builders illustrates the truth of that statement and underscores the warning of the previous verses not to be deluded into thinking that simply calling Jesus Lord or doing things in his name even apparently miraculous things, is enough to gain entry into the kingdom. The second thing to note is the word everyone. As in the previous verses and indeed throughout the sermon, Jesus is speaking directly to his disciples, calling them to a life that demonstrates that they are citizens of the kingdom. But throughout these signposts, we have noted that Jesus is also speaking to the crowds to whom he has consistently extended an invitation to the kingdom of heaven. Jesus is not inviting outsiders to come and agree with a set of precepts or religious dogmas and doctrines. He's calling people to a life of pledged allegiance to him as the saving King, and that life has a particular shape to it, and that shape is described throughout the Sermon on the Mount. Thirdly, we should note that the phrase, "these words of mine," is most likely a reference to the content of the entire Sermon on the Mount, not just the previous verses. Many scholars believe that the content of the Sermon on the Mount is the basic, the minimum that Jesus expects from his followers. St. Augustine viewed the Sermon on the Mount as the perfect measure of the Christian life, filled with all the precepts by which the Christian life is formed. In the 4th century, the Church Father Chrysostom wrote, "Even before heaven, Christ commands us to make earth heaven, and while living here on earth to conduct ourselves as citizens of there." The Sermon on the Mount, then, is not a dissertation on popular theological ideas to be debated and then agreed on or dismissed. Rather, it presents a way of living in the world that not only transforms the life of the disciple, but also by consequence also transforms the world around us and gives non-believers a glimpse of what the kingdom of God looks like. It's no wonder, therefore, that the theologian Charles Quarles notes that no sermon ever preached has been more significant to the Christian church than the Sermon on the Mount. It is and always has been Jesus' foundational message to the church. And that touches on what I think is one of the crucial issues with this Sermon on the Mount, namely, to what extent are we meant to actually apply its teaching to our everyday lives? From the first centuries of the church until the Middle Ages, the dominant view had been that of St. Augustine, who said that the petition "forgive our debts" was necessary because of our inability to perfectly fulfill the demands of the sermon. In other words, he believed that we were meant to apply the sermon literally. We're meant to apply it into our lives. It's not something to wait until the kingdom of God comes in all its fullness. It's for here and now. But because of our sinful nature, we'll never be able to apply it perfectly at all times and in all situations. And so we need to pray, "Forgive us our debts." It was Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages who introduced the idea that not every part of the Sermon on the Mount was applicable to every believer. He created a distinction between what he called precepts and counsels. Precepts were commands that followers of Christ were obligated to obey, whereas counsels were simply guides towards Christ-likeness that weren't obligatory, but which might be adopted by those who wish to attain true holiness. In other words, you get to pick and choose which bits of the sermon apply to your life and which bits you can ignore. Still a very popular idea today. In contrast to all of that, the Anabaptists in the 16th century stressed that all Christians should obey the Sermon on the Mount in the most radical way, even to the point of forbidding violence, even for the purpose of self-defense, the rejection of all military force, and sometimes even the rejection of personal property. Needless to say, these ideas didn't catch on in the wider church or society, and so many Anabaptists retreated into communities like the Amish or the Buderhof that still exist around the world today. All of these views are commonly held still within the breadth of the Christian church in the 21st century. Yet Jesus' closing words in the sermon leave us in no doubt that his words are not meant to be admired, written about, or reflected upon, though all of those things are positive and helpful. Rather, his words are meant to be actually applied into our actual everyday lives. It is as we seek to obey his words and apply them in our everyday lives that we are changed more and more to be like him, and so society around us is changed and affected. After writing a book on the Sermon on the Mount, theologian Charles Quarles wrote that it led him to see himself in new ways. He said, "I've been encouraged by Jesus' promises, indicted by his rebukes, stirred by his challenges, strengthened by his presence. I've learned the importance of seeking to live in accord with God's character and not merely his commands. I've aspired for holiness as a participant in the new Exodus, a recipient of new creation, and a beneficiary of the new covenant. Jesus' words have caused my stomach to grumble with a new hunger for righteousness, and have parched my throat with a new thirst for Christ-likeness." or that we all felt the same as that. But the process of change is never easy, especially when that change goes against the grain of our culture and our own sinful nature. And Jesus never pretends that it is easy. In fact, when you read the Gospels, it's almost as if he's trying to put people off from making that commitment to him. He speaks of troubles, of suffering and persecution, of counting the cost, and of carrying your cross. It's no wonder that G.K. Chesterton once quipped that Christianity had not been tried and found wanting, it had been found difficult and left untried. No one will be able to say to Jesus on the day of judgment that he never told them how hard it would be to be his disciple. However, the life reflected in the Sermon on the Mount is the only kind of life that demonstrates citizenship of the kingdom of heaven. The question that we have to end with then is quite simple. What will we do with Jesus' sermon? Or perhaps a better question to ask is, to what extent am I trying to apply the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount in my everyday life? As A.M. Hunter has written, after 1900 years the Sermon on the Mount still haunts men. They may praise it as Mahatma Gandhi did, or like Nietzsche they may curse it, but they cannot ignore it, and nor can we. The parable that closes the sermon leaves us with no room to manoeuvre our way out of full obedience to the teaching in the sermon. The location of the Sea of Galilee provides a natural setting for this parable. The sand on the seashore there was quite hard on the surface during the summer months, but it remained unstable just below the surface. Any wise builder would have dug down to bedrock and to lay foundations for his house. For when the winter rains came, the Jordan would overflow and homes built on the sand would be washed away because they weren't built on a solid foundation. You know, there's an idiom in our culture that has countless variations, but that always begins with the same line. There are two kinds of people in the world. My favourite version is the one that goes, there are only 10 kinds of people in the world, those who understand binary and those who don't. That's funny, by the way. In a variety of ways in this sermon, Jesus has consistently been saying that there are only two kinds of people in the world. Those who are salt and light and those who aren't. Those who forgive and those who don't. Those who love their enemies and those who don't. Those who are on the wide road that leads to destruction and those who are on the narrow road that leads to life. And now he speaks of those who build their lives on a solid foundation and those who don't. As a conclusion to the sermon, the imagery of building on a foundation perhaps suggests that what Jesus has been teaching in the sermon is foundational to discipleship, and that it's vital that we get that foundation right. Since the therefore of verse 24 points us back to the previous section, we can say that this illustration of solid and shifting foundations also serves to identify true disciples from false disciples. That it's what we are building our lives on that demonstrates the difference. And it therefore suggests that disciples are called not just to believe, but also to act, to do something, to build. To say that we are not called merely to believe that the foundation is solid, but also to build on that solid foundation underscores the point that it's not enough simply to believe that Jesus is Lord or to say it. We must also act on that belief. In fact, we can say confidently that the whole Sermon on the Mount is a call to action. We should note that the aim and goal of both builders is the same. Both presumably want to provide a good home for their families, and nothing is said in the parable to suggest that there was any difference in the quality of their workmanship or of their dedication and commitment to the job. The only difference is the foundation upon which they are building. It doesn't matter how skilled you are at building if you build on the wrong foundation. The famous and very beautiful Tower of Pisa is also known as the Leaning Tower of Pisa, but it used to be straight. It used to just be the Tower of Pisa. Unfortunately, it began to lean during the 12th century because the soft ground it was built on couldn't support its weight. Interestingly, the tilt got worse throughout the completion of its construction in the 14th century. In other words, despite the fact that it was already leaning, they kept on building it. By 1990, the tower was tilting 5.5 degrees and is now only standing because of clever modern engineering support. Many people make the same mistake with their own lives. Even though the foundation is poor, they keep building on it, and then they prop up their lives with all kinds of clever things to delay the fall. We shouldn't miss the fact that in the parable, it's a storm that reveals the quality of the foundations. When the storm hits, it's too late to lay a better foundation. And nor should we miss the fact that Jesus says when the storm hits, not if the storm hits. In the context of entering the kingdom of God, this would be illustrated of the inevitability of the final judgment. There are people who will not discover it until it's too late that the foundation upon which they have been building their lives upon is built on shifting sand. Jesus is unequivocal. Those who have built their lives on a foundation of shifting sand will not enter the kingdom of God, no matter how much they've tried to prop it up. Jesus will not allow us the freedom to call him Lord and then build our lives on any foundation that we want to. As Karl Barth has said, to say that Jesus is Lord is to say that all others are not. And so we're back where we started. Are we sure that our lives are being built on the right foundation? Let's not wait until the storm comes to find out, for then it will be too late, and like a house built on sand, all that we have built will be washed away. It's only when our lives are built on a solid foundation that they survive the storm. Thanks for listening.